we're not really in the business anymore of issuing new visas. We want to give American freight to American drivers, and that's the direction in which this industry is going. So you're going to see a lot more enforcement as 2026 rolls out based on the performance of 2025.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Transportation Nation. I'm your host, Lee Gentry, along with my co-host, Miss Caitlyn Folks. Good morning, Miss Caitlyn.
Good morning, Lee, and Happy New Year.
Thank you. Here we are getting ready for a brand new year.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, we have a pretty aggressive first quarter.
Yep.
We've got a few pretty interesting guests coming to join us, which I think people are going to really enjoy. But today we have a very special guest. We have Mr. David Heller with us today from TCA, the Truckload Carriers Association, is going to be talking with us today. So, David, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Lee. Good morning, Caitlyn. Thank you both for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. It's always great getting out of D.C. This is the best part of my job when I get to come see the carrier members of TCA and see how the world works outside of the Beltway, right? And because it's a distinctly different thing when you're talking to members of Congress or regulators at FMCSA. And it's one thing when you do so under theory, but when you come and see how the members and how operations run, and when you come to do podcasts like this, it makes for a great trip and a great day for me. So thank you both for having me. I'm real excited to be here, and I'm excited for this conversation too.
We are too.
Well, thank you, David. And like Lee said, we're so honored to have you. So I'm going to share with our listeners who don't know as much about you as we've gotten the pleasure to know. So I'm going to share with them a little bit about your bio. So David Heller is the Senior Vice President of Safety and Government Affairs for the Truckload Carriers Association, which is a leading national trade organization focused exclusively on the truckload segment of the United States freight industry. He's been a trusted voice in trucking policy, safety, and regulatory affairs for over 2 decades, and helping carriers understand and influence national policy from FMCSA to Capitol Hill advocacy. So, David, as we've just shared your bio with us and a little bit about TCA, why don't you share with us the mission behind TCA?
Yeah, and TCA is a trade organization that's made up of motor carrier members, much like Bennett. And the one thing we take pride in saying is that there's nothing worse in our industry than a poor competitor. So in saying that, we'd like to put our members front and center and make them a better business, whether it is interest for the driver, making them run their businesses better. It's our mission to educate them, talk about rules and regulations on Capitol Hill in terms of advocacy, and to make sure that the members of our association certainly operate better, safer than anybody else on the roadway. There's an ATRI study out that showed that carriers that are members of either their state trucking association and a national trade association like TCA are inherently safer than those carriers that are not members of those organizations.
That is interesting.
So it's one of those situations where we take pride in that. There's no doubt about it. And we want to make our carrier members a better business, and then they in turn help make TCA a better trade association.
I love that. That's wonderful.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, well, and I've had the joy of knowing you for quite a long time, but 20 years at the Truckload Carriers Association, I know you've seen a lot and done a lot. So I want to jump in right away. So Caitlyn and I talked about this. So the big thing on our mind, and I think a lot of people who are watching this episode today, is the immigration licensing. I mean, everybody's talking about it. I mean, we've had horrific accidents because of it. Safety, the public perception of that whole situation. How do you think how that's going to affect our carriers in 2026? I mean, everybody's talking about it. Drivers are worried that these immigrants that are coming in our country illegally are getting licenses and taking away some jobs. I don't know. There's a lot to talk about, especially we all saw the accident on TV. So tell us, what do you see going in 2026 and how it's going to affect the carriers in 26?
Well, I think we're going to see more of the same in terms of enforcement, right? You talk about, is this political pressure? Is this public perception? And I think that's all rolled into one. I mean, it's no secret that we had some very high-profile accidents in the state of Florida, in the state of California, that has kind of added fuel to this fire. Now, I've been doing this for 2 decades plus, and you always hear those stories about foreign drivers and non-domiciled drivers that are coming in and hauling freight in the United States at the expense of our regular American professional truck driver. And the bigger question was nobody could ever knew who was actually doing this. So when the administration came in and took charge, they said, here's an opportunity where we can fix this problem. And it's a safety problem. And they started you talk about English language proficiency. And I can't tell you the amount of times my phone rang or the amount of emails that I've gotten just based on these issues alone. I mean, it was enough to be a full-time job for just the time fielding these questions. So the industry was very concerned and certainly and how these things were going to shake out. And it certainly comes at the heels of a confirmation of a new administrator at FMCSA, Derek Bars. Wonderful man. He is a fantastic representative of our industry. And in my opinion, I can't think of a better representative to lead FMCSA than Mr. Bars and his enforcement background, which basically showed that this is the direction in which our industry was going to go. You're talking more enforcement, greater enforcement, non-domiciled CDL issues, English language proficiency issues. And it translates to a safety problem. I mean, it just shows that those drivers out there that may have trouble communicating in the English language, that don't have a CDL that's married to their visa expiration date, are inherently less safe than our American drivers that are operating on the roads today. So this became a position of the administration to sit there and curb that and really break down what is actually happening there. And they started enforcing that 391.11B2 standard. And we all know we can't advocate non-compliance of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. It just doesn't make sense to do so. So as an industry, we have to be compliant with the rules and regulations, particularly ones that have been there for generations, which this one has. And somewhere along the lines, they stopped enforcing that. So the administration came in and said, nope, it's time to start enforcing that again, which kind of was the stepping stone to where we are today. And they've started putting drivers out of service for not being able to communicate in the English language. They've actually had states starting to look at their CDLs. Now, one of the issues is the court certainly got involved and issued a stay on that non-domiciled rule. But at the same point, the states are still going about and enforcing it. And you're probably seeing with some of those non-domiciled CDL drivers where their CDLs are getting revoked because they weren't married with the same expiration date as their visa. So the situation comes where carriers are pulling MVRs almost on a monthly basis on some drivers that they may have working for them or terminating them altogether because that's just the direction that they go in, because once the visa expires, that CDL is going to expire. And we're not really in the business anymore of issuing new visas. We want to give American freight to American drivers, and that's the direction in which this industry is going. So you're going to see a lot more enforcement as 2026 rolls out based on the performance of 2025. And it's amazing how time flies because it seems like yesterday when all this started happening, but I think enforcement is going to go to a greater extent. You know, the longstanding joke with enforcement was always, oh, I'm with the federal government, I'm here to help, right? And that always got a good laugh because I always made that joke. But it's different now. They are actually enforcing it in the tune of helping motor carriers and helping motor carriers like Bennett become a safer motor carrier and making the industry safer, because you're starting to see a lot of drivers leave the industry. And then the side tangent to all this is the effects on capacity. You're going to start seeing capacity tighten. We've already started seeing it already. And that capacity will start to tighten, whereas rates will start to go up. So it makes for an interesting part of the industry because you have a safety-based regulation that is being enforced, but is being enforced in the manner in which drivers are now leaving the industry, which then it tightens capacity. So there are benefits on every side up to this, and it's one that we're going to keep seeing more and more of as the.
And I'm sure a lot of this is being driven by political or perception. You got people out, just normal people are pretty upset with this whole process.
Sure, and it's no secret that the Trump administration is a very aggressive administration. There's no doubt about it. And, the times have changed. The regulatory process used to be a very, very, very slow moving process. I mean, you could pretty much time it with a calendar, if that makes any sense. It would slow move and, the Rolling Stone gathers no moss type of situation. But now it's different. The Trump administration will execute or release an executive order, which is how all of this has gotten started, which virtually changes things overnight. It is no longer a year's process to do something like this. It is done overnight, and the administration has taken action to enforce these regulations, which was a policy change from what it previously existed. The previous administration would have allowed drivers to use things like Google Translate on their cell phones to help communicate with roadside enforcement or communicate with the customer, the shipper. And this administration says no more. Here's the regulation and here's what we need to abide by. It's good for safety, it's good for business, and it's good for this country. And that's the direction they're going in.
Is part of that regulation making English mandatory? I know that they have to do certain things when it comes to the English language, but is some of that play into some of it?
In a nutshell, the regulation reads that a truck driver, professional truck driver, has to have the ability to communicate, read, and conversate
Right.
English language.
Have an understanding.
So effectively,
Read the signs out on the street.
effectively,
Right.
effectively what it does is it makes English language, and again, the rule has been there for decades, to make English language that standard.
Mhm.
So, and we can't just assume this is a Spanish-speaking issue, because it's not just a Spanish-speaking
Correct.
issue. There are parts of this country where they may have had drivers come in on visas from Eastern Europe. So it's not necessarily one that is directed strictly towards the Spanish-speaking population. This is one that basically brings English into the fold as that sole language in which conversations, communications, enforcement actions have to happen. There are states in this country that offer the CDL test in 7 different languages. That's not going to happen anymore. It doesn't make sense to do that when that driver in question or potential driver has to have an English language proficiency in order to operate a commercial motor vehicle.
Great point. All right. So I have a question for you, David, on this same topic. So as the federal and state governments tighten on the CDL verification and the enforcements, what challenges do you anticipate for carriers? I know you kind of touched on it on the capacity, but the labor availability or on anything else compliance that we haven't covered already.
Sure. And, and there's all of that, right? It all mingles into, there is a labor aspect to this, because there may be carriers out there that have a large population of drivers that may be non-domiciled CDL holders or non-English speaking. Their whole operation changes, which makes it a big labor issue in terms of that. Now, what is also starting to happen, and there's a tremendous effect it has on capacity. So FMCSA estimates that there was about an English language proficiency problem for about 3.8% of the driver population. So let's say roughly 3.6 million CDL holders in the United States alone. It's not a small number.
No.
What's 3.8% of 3.6 million CDLs? It's about 133, 140,000 drivers out there that this is going to affect. And they knew this going into it because they knew they had laxed enforcement up until this point of this regulation. So when you look at that and you see the effects on labor, you're talking about pulling 140,000 drivers right out of the pool. And what happens when that happens? Well, capacity starts to tighten. So it means it makes for better business, right? The world of the professional truck driver and the demand of the professional truck driver is now starting to show up. If you've seen any load tenders out there, you're starting to see them come in with the phrase US DOT compliant English speaking drivers, which means there's just not a home for those that are not compliant. And let me emphasize this again. This is a compliance issue with existing regulations. And we can't advocate noncompliance. We have to abide by compliance. It doesn't make sense for a carrier to advocate noncompliance with any rule or regulation because it's going to catch up to them. The reality, it is affecting the labor pool, and that's just on the English language proficiency, not even considering the non-domiciled CDL holders. Now, if we assume that they're 2 separate groups, which in some cases they'll be the same group, but if we assume they're 2 separate groups, they're estimating that non-domiciled CDL holders is going to affect about 194,000 drivers, which if you put those 2 numbers together, you're talking somewhere over 300,000 drivers that will be removed from our system in a matter of months now, right? I mean, you're talking about a 2-year window where all of this could effectively take place. And what happens when you remove that amount of drivers from the system? This is not a situation where shelves are going to be empty at Target or Walmart. This is a situation where there's a premium for the professional truck driver out there. It's a skilled labor. There's no doubt about it. I think everybody can agree it takes a special talent to be a truck driver in this country. And I'm real pleased to represent them and say that all the time because it really does. And in saying that, these drivers are going to be the premier drivers of the industry, which is one of the things that you have here at Bennett, one of the things the TCA members have, across the whole board. And saying that, it just puts them at a premium, and it's going to do a wonderful thing for this industry.
Let me ask you too, will these drivers, once, they can renew their visa, they can go out and retake these tests? I mean, do you see some of these drivers re-entering into this labor market following the strict regulations and compliance going forward with this?
Well, and you have to look at the world of visa issuance, right? And, the Trump administration has not been too kind on renewing visas out there, particularly as it affects the American workplace. So the longstanding theory is they're probably not going to get a new visa.
Okay.
There's very large dollar figures that are being attached to renewing visas. I've heard $15,000. I've heard $100,000, depending on the visa.
People can't afford that.
It's one of those situations that they're going to have to really want it with those dollars that are attached to it to renew those visas. So the reality and the expectation is these drivers, this driving population that is operating under a non-domiciled CDL, they're going to marry that CDL with the visa and make sure they both have the same expiration date. Because the problem is the CDL oftentimes lasted longer than their visa did, but it gave them another government document allowing them opportunities to be in this country. So now if they marry the two dates together, meaning once that visa expires, so does that CDL. And they'll be forced to leave the market. They'll be forced to leave the country because likely they're not going to get another visa under this administration.
That's going to be a major effect in our industry.
Right. So this is going to be a lot of time going with this.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to affect, our industry, especially with, the drivers. We look for drivers every day. Ones that fit into our culture and they have a safe driving record. But, that unfortunately, that accident, threw up the big red flag of awareness. And a lot of that has come from that. So, but beyond the licensing and immigration, what regulatory or safety issues do you think will define the trucking landscape as we go into 26?
And that's a great question because the landscape is an entirely new one. We talked about enforcement, and it's all enforcement surrounding, this English language proficiency or non-domiciled CDL has raised the awareness of the administration. Secretary Duffy, the Secretary of Transportation, he called into question truck driving schools. Who is training these drivers?
Oh.
How are they getting a CDL out of school if they're unable to speak the language? So he's called that into
common sense question.
It is.
I mean, most people have that same question.
Here's the regulation, right? And this is what these drivers are trained on. Here's the regulation, 391.11B2. How are you getting out of truck driving school if you can't satisfy that portion of the regulation? So even that's been called into question. So when I say enforcement, this is not just enforcement on the CDL, although the CDL has been put under a major spotlight. This is enforcement of truck driver training schools as well. They're going to start going in and have already done so. They've revoked the status of 3,000 already off the training provider registry. They've put 4,000 additional ones on notice. So this becomes that issue of they're now looking at this regulation. Now, here's the interesting thing. The entry-level driver training regulation are minimum standards. And I know this because I sat on the entry-level driver training advisory committee during the negotiated rulemaking at FMCSA. So they're minimum standards designed for a driver to show proficiency to operate a commercial motor vehicle. So there's always been that argument, is it should be hours-based, should it be proficient-based? Well, there's a couple different ways to look at it. And somebody once told me, would you rather have a professional truck driver demonstrate a proficiency for operating a commercial motor vehicle or one that has achieved the right number of hours? Well, give me the proficient one 6 days a week and twice on Sundays, because it works the same for pilots, right? Do you want an airline pilot that is proficient in flying that plane or one that has just achieved the right amount of hours? Mm-hmm. In the state of Virginia, a barber needs to achieve so many hours of training before they get this license. I live in Virginia. Clearly that hasn't helped me. My point being is all of these things come into play. So you're starting to see a lot of enforcement actions. You're going to see it over schools, drivers, carriers. You're starting to see a lot more compliance reviews. Now, the issue with that, right, is there's roughly about 650,000 motor carriers operating on the roads today without a safety fitness determination, right? And that's the satisfactory, unsatisfactory, conditional rating. So they have to start doing compliance reviews for that. Or in some instances, there are some carriers whose safety rating dates back 30 years. Is that truly reflective of their safety operations? And this isn't a question of saying we want to go in and see the bad actors. This is a question of We want to lay eyes on your safety program, and we want to make sure it's up to snuff. And there are cases, and I always highlight this, they want to capture carriers doing something good just as much as they want to capture carriers doing something bad. I know several carriers who have already gone through a compliance review, and they're using those operations as a test case to highlight the good of our industry, the safety performance of our industry. So 2026, you're going to see a lot more enforcement action, not just on the drivers, but on carriers with compliance reviews to get a safety fitness determination. You're going to see it on schools as they operate under what is perceived to be minimum standards, and hopefully remove those CDL mills that do a poor job of training drivers in the first place. So that our industry is effectively going to get safer. It's going to reflect those numbers. Derek Bars said, if we continue to do the things the same way we always do, we should never expect different results. So they're changing it up. They're changing up doing things the way we always did, and they're focusing on compliance with existing rules and regulations. I would say it's somewhat simple, right? When they issue regulations, they do so under a manner of what is called assumed compliance, which, Caitlyn, is kind of like saying, here's the law, Caitlyn, you have to put your seatbelt on when you get behind the wheel of the car. This is what the law says. But that doesn't necessarily mean you always do it. And until you're caught not doing it, as do I, but until you're caught not doing it, would it be a problem, right? So it's the same thing under these regulations, but now they're doing more enforcement, planning on doing more enforcement, checking up on these operators that are operating across the industry, whether it is a carrier, whether it is a driver, whether it is a school. You're starting to see all segments of the industry to have eyes laid on them. And it's certainly going to be an effective tool, and it's going to do a lot for this industry.
All I can say is things are going to change in 2026 as far as enforcement and doing all of this. So, wow, thanks for sharing that. Let's change up the subject a little bit. I think we've covered that subject pretty good, and that was pretty strong on my mind because of things that are going on in the industry today. But I think Caitlyn, next subject, we've talked about hours of service.
Yeah. So David, as hours of service continues to be, a pain point for fleets and drivers, what are some of the challenges that still exist in aligning the hours of service policy with the realities of how drivers actually operate day to day?
Question.
It's a great question. And, the reality is no 2 days are ever the same for any professional truck driver out there. I don't think any 2 days are the same for any of us sitting in this room. We're just not driving a truck down the interstate at this point in time. So detention time still exists, and it continues to be a pain point for our driving population. And those drivers are getting detained, and how do their hours of service effectively work at that? So you're seeing a lot of talk over the hours of service regulations. The agency just issued or announced that they want to convene 2 pilot programs for the hours of service. And this will effectively really affect the truckload market of the industry, right? Those that are operating fully under those hours of service, because they want to increase flexibility for those drivers that are operating. So they're going to do a pilot program that incorporates a 6 and 4 or even a 5 and 5 split to their day. Right now, drivers at the max can do that 7 and 3 split. And that's where it ends over their off-duty time. So if they put a 5 and 5 split for their sleeper berth or a 6 and 4 split, drivers would be able to do more things like adjust for congestion, which, congestion's not going away. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that in a little while too, but it's not going away. So if you have a driver that's coming upon Washington, D.C., and here in Atlanta, it's no different with Spaghetti Junction and what have you. So traffic isn't going to go away, but they need to give drivers the ability to address that and shut down in a manner that is compliant and safe. Look, this is a world where it's not going to be a free-for-all and let drivers drive whenever they want to. There are issues such as fatigue driving that almost always come into play. But the reality is drivers must be given the notion of flexibility so that they can address their day. Because no 2 days are the same. They may get detained at a shipping facility. They may get detained at their drop-off point. Any of these situations creates a problem and a hassle, and there is no perfect day for the professional truck driver. Now, in saying that, right, they're all operating under ELDs nowadays, which again is another.
We're just going to mention the ELDs. That's changed their life.
Yep.
Rather than just writing in a logbook.
Correct.
Now the electronics is tracking everything that they do.
Correct. Previously, every day was a perfect driving day for a driver when they were doing a logbook, right? It was a pencil and eraser worked great. And, let's not hide from the fact that, logs were very fraudulent back in the day. And ELDs eliminate some of that, and it's going to do an even better job of eliminating that because we talked about enforcement, and guess what? The agency is going to start cracking down on enforcement over fraudulent ELDs as well, and is starting to do so. So that's part of this whole thing. So there are changes to hours of service coming that can be beneficial for the professional truck driver, particularly in the truckload segment when they're hauling freight across the country. They have to take their 10 hours off. They have to take their restarts, but giving them greater flexibility to address the things that happen in their day. I mean, it's January, right? We see cold weather come in. You can see a snowstorm come in where, we always say the drivers that captain this ship, this affords them added luxury of flexibility so that they may be able to pull over and wait a storm out before they get on the road and improve their safety performance. So we shouldn't look at hours of service in a negative light, and we should view these prospective changes in terms of pilot programs that the agency is undertaking as positive changes, positive steps.
It's there to help keep them safe.
Correct. It's one of those situations where it could give drivers greater flexibility and also make them safer at the same time.
I think that's the bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
Let's keep them safe.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about some truck parking. Truck parking, that's always a hot subject. So I know that Alicia Eccles, who leads our Women in the Driver's Seat here, went up to Washington last year and joined the Women in Trucking. And they went up there to call in Washington, kind of like what you folks do as well. I've been part of that in the past. But one of their subject up there was about truck parking. It's a big deal. And so we know that they've finally put some funds out there to help. But in reality, how is that really helping? Are we getting anywhere on increasing for truck parking?
I wish we would. And we've done a great job of now describing the problem, right? There's one spot for every 11 drivers out on the road today, which is not a good situation to have. In fact, the professional driver, as I understand it, loses approximately $7,000 in personal income yearly just looking for safe and secure truck parking. So hours of service flexibility helps, right? Giving them more flexible hours so that they can adjust that would certainly help. But the reality is going to be finding dollars available to build new parking spaces and build new parking spaces where the freight is, right? It makes no sense to put 100 parking spaces for trucks in North Dakota when no trucks are going there. You have to talk about major freight lanes, right? When you do this. And there's freight corridors out there that would have some dollars invested to improve the parking problem. Now, it's reached an epidemic. There's no doubt about it. In fact, in ATRI's study, the top 10 issues, it somewhat jogs back and forth, parking and compensation as the top issues that drivers want to deal with. So to replace compensation with truck parking is a big thing if drivers are seeing that as a major problem. And without a doubt, we have to do a better job of educating our representatives on Capitol Hill. Mm-hmm. We're doing that. I can tell you, I've had conversations on Capitol Hill about truck parking where, they try to sit there and say, well, if this is such a problem, why don't we just put more things on trains? And so, I kind of chuckled at that when they said that. And they said, well, what are you laughing at? And I said, all right, let's put more freights on trains. But you tell me this, where do you buy your milk? And they said they go to Whole Foods to buy their milk. I said, next time you go buy your milk, go outside of Whole Foods, look around back and see if there's a train track.
Mm-hmm.
Great point.
Good point.
And he just kind of looked at me funny and he said, I never heard it put in that way before. And I said, you don't understand. There's not a thing that you likely don't own that hasn't been on a truck at some point in time. Yeah. And the reality is it's not all going to go by train. Trucking is the most flexible form of freight transportation in this country. Mm-hmm. And we have to find better places to park. You have to remember the national interstate system was designed in the 50s and 60s and was designed so on the basis of national defense, not freight movement. Mm-hmm. So in saying that, what didn't exist back when this interstate system was designed? Amazon, right? And everybody has Amazon packages that are coming to their doorstep virtually every day. If you're like my house, we're a cardboard recycling facility as well as a package.
I think most of Americans are becoming that way.
Right. So the freight delivery model has gotten so prolific that we just forgot we needed places to park these trucks. Mm-hmm. And so we need to do so. And there's active bills in Congress right now. There's a bill that Congressman Mike Bost has introduced that called for $755 million over 5 years to be put towards solving this problem or helping create safer and more secure locations to park trucks. Mm-hmm. And that's for both public and private entities. So whether it's a municipal rest stop you see on an interstate or it's a private place like Love's Travel Stops mm-hmm. or or Pilot Flying J or something like, they could have access to this money to help improve their locations as well. So it's something that we have to address. I can't imagine that our next highway bill will go through without some sort of parking adjustment made to it, because the problem isn't going away. It's only going to get worse, and will continue to get worse unless we do something about it.
Well, thanks for you and the TCA addressing all that. So we appreciate it. You're a great advocate for us.
Yeah, because going back to the hours of service, if we want to be safer, they've got to have these places to take their breaks and to rest. So I know you said it's been a problem for decades, and it's just going to continue if we don't figure, because real estate is real estate. It's tight. So I know that that's great that they're wanting to put that much money towards solving the problem.
It's important, as you mentioned, Caitlyn, the safety part of it.
Yeah.
They've got to be able to park to be able to rest and sleep and whatever they need to do.
Be sure to join us next time for part 2 of our conversation with David Heller. You won't want to miss it. In the meantime, be sure to like and subscribe to Transportation Nation Podcast.